Today I will talk about something that is forbidden to discuss in modern Russia, about the truth, about what really happened in Chechnya. How Russia simply killed thousands of civilians, just like that, simply for power, ambition, and of course resources. After watching this video, you will know everything about the war in Chechnya, the truth and nothing but the truth. I'm Semyon and this is Megashow TV. Let's begin. The reasons and history of the conflict. With the beginning of perestroika, national patriotic movements became more active in various republics of the USSR, realizing that this was the best time to free themselves from years of occupation. Against this backdrop, specifically in Chechnya, the All-National Congress of the Chechen people was established in 1990, led by General Jokhar Dudayev, whose goal was for Chechnya to secede from the Soviet Union. June 8, 1990. That same year, this Congress declared the independence of the Chechen Republic. I would like to note that this was done fully in accordance with all the laws and the constitution of the USSR, which gave complete legitimacy to its independence. And on September 6, they announced the dissolution of the state structures of the Chechen-Ingush Autonomous Republic, whose leadership had supported the August coup in Moscow. On the same day, the Dudayev government took control of the Parliament building, the television center, and the Dom Radio building in Grozny. After the collapse of the USSR in December 1991, the newly elected President Dudayev announced the state's withdrawal from the Russian Federation. In December of the same year, the Chechen-Ingush ASSR ceased to exist legally. As a result, Chechnya became a de facto independent state, but one that was legally recognized by almost no one, since at that time it was recognized only by Georgia and Afghanistan. Now imagine the shock and horror of Russia, which by 1991 had lost almost all the lands it had occupied for decades. But of course the Russians could not accept this, and building their own country with their own hands was not exactly a royal task, so to speak. So the only way out is war and the struggle for territory. However, nothing new here. Based on this, we can identify two reasons that became key in the emergence of the conflict between Chechnya and the Russian Federation. The first is the Chechen Republic's desire for complete independence, which did not align with Russia's plans for it. The second is Russia's constant desire to keep as many territories of the former Soviet Union within its borders as possible, and ideally to restore the borders of the USSR altogether. Roughly speaking, these two reasons are opposite to each other, which is why an obvious conflict of interests arose between the Chechen Republic and the Russian Federation. Some want freedom, while others strive for authoritarianism. At the same time, if we look at it from the perspective of global history, the confrontation between the two peoples began much earlier than 1994. The Chechens are the indigenous people of their land, meaning its original inhabitants, since the ancestors of modern Chechens and Ingush are mentioned in Armenian sources as early as the 7th century. The Chechens are the most numerous people of the North Caucasus, and one of the largest in the entire Caucasus region. In terms of population, they are surpassed only by Georgians, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis. At the end of the 20th century, there were about 1 million Chechens in the Caucasus, which was not a small number for that time. Russia first invaded Chechnya at the beginning of the 18th century during the time of Peter I. At the end of the century, Russia committed the first acts of genocide against the Chechens. At that time, there were attempts at mass resettlement of the indigenous population and its total extermination. I will not rest until there is not a single Chechen left alive. These words were engraved on a bronze monument to Yermolov, erected in Grozny in 1949 after the deportation of the Chechen people. During the Caucasian War, as a result of a policy of brutal extermination, about 3/4 of the entire population of Chechnya perished. At the same time, the territories of the Caucasian states were still seized by Russia. Fascism? No, never heard of it. I won't talk about mass deportations today, only because we have an entire video dedicated to this topic on our channel. By 1991, after the declaration of state sovereignty, the Chechen-Ingush ASSR was transformed into a union republic. And then, as I already mentioned, based on all the laws and the constitution of the USSR, it left the Soviet Union and became an independent state. It had every right to do so. After that, Chechnya became the first country to sign an agreement on the withdrawal of Russian former Soviet troops from its territory. With these actions, Russia legally recognized the independence of the Chechen Republic, but this recognition did not last long. It only lasted for 3 years. And then Russia remembered its imperial ambitions. The beginning and course of the war? Surprisingly, Russia approached the start of the war in its usual way. What's funny is that the government at that time was not the same as the one in Russia now. From this, one conclusion can be drawn. The desire to take what belongs to others, the urge for aggression to fulfill their needs, is in the blood of Russians. This is the result of centuries of upbringing, probably starting from Peter I, repeatedly raising generations in Russia on revenge, cruelty, and envy. So, before the hostilities, the Russian Federation tried to destabilize the internal structure of Chechen society as much as possible. A transport and financial blockade of Chechnya was established, which led to the collapse of the Chechen economy and the rapid impoverishment of the population. After that, Russian intelligence services began an operation to incite an internal armed conflict in Chechnya. The forces of the anti-Dudayev opposition were trained at Russian military bases and supplied with weapons. At the same time, despite the fact that the anti-Dudayev forces accepted Russian assistance, their leaders stated that the armed confrontation in Chechnya was exclusively their own affair. And in the event of Russian military intervention, they would forget their differences and, together with Dudayev, defend their independence. Do you see the difference between Russians and Chechens? The people of Chechnya openly said that in the event of an attack, absolutely everyone would fight for freedom, because traitors are not just disliked there, they do not raise traitors there. Inciting a fratricidal war was alien to the Chechen mentality and contradicted their national traditions. Therefore, despite the Russian authorities' strong desire to break the Chechen system, armed confrontation within it did not lead to any result. Without much hesitation, the Russian leadership decided that a Russian military operation in Chechnya was necessary. It is worth noting that this was not an easy task for the Russian Federation, since a significant military arsenal had been left to the Chechen Republic by the Soviet army. In addition, the Chechens also created their own regular army and began producing their own Boros assault rifle. Therefore, Chechnya's combat readiness was at its maximum. It is unclear why the incompetent Russian soldiers got involved. In 1994, the Russians had exactly the same plan as in the joke about Kiev, to finish it in 3 days. And now, think carefully and listen to what I'm about to say, because this is a classic example of rewriting history. On November 26, 1994, the Russians tried to storm Grozny, but their attempt failed. As a result of the failed assault, a large number of Russian soldiers were captured, and Russia's involvement was documented. But what do you think the Russian authorities said? What, no one guessed? That's right. They're not there. There are no Russian troops there. It's just the Chechens fighting among themselves. That's how it is now. Russia is lying to its own people, rewriting history. Back then too, they told fairy tales that everyone loved the Russian world. At Russia's Security Council meeting on November 29, right before Russia, so to speak, officially attacks Chechnya, the Minister for Nationalities Affairs, Nikolai Yegorov, stated that supposedly 70% of Chechens would support the deployment of troops and would gladly welcome Russian soldiers, and the remaining 30% would be neutral. Where's the logic in that? How can you be Russian and believe in this nonsense? If everyone is supposedly waiting for the Russian world, then why was there such a brutal war in Chechnya? Why didn't a single city in Ukraine welcome the Russians with open arms? Are Russians really so blind that they don't see that no one has ever been waiting for them? That they've always acted as ordinary criminals and looters? By the way, when I mentioned looters and the events in Chechnya, I remembered one of the so-called good Russians nowadays, namely Alexander Nevzorov. Yes, that's the very person who's now strongly opposing Putin, but there was a time when he was one of Putin's trusted representatives. And about the events of 1994, back then he said it was time to stop using the term the deployment of Russian troops into Chechnya. We can't deploy Russian troops on the territory of Russia. Funny, isn't it? And why did I remember this in connection with looting? People with common sense will understand my indignation now. Nevzorov believes that Crimea's accession to Russia is a real act of looting. It sounds good and smooth, doesn't it? However, then he says that he doesn't see anything wrong with looting since he's not a moralist. He says that he never regrets what he has done, and that's a key point. After all, he did quite a lot of things in his time. Read about the National Liberation Movement Nashi. Why am I saying this? The point is, I don't trust people like him. At some point he turned against Putin, and the Putin system accordingly turned against him, and that's all there is to it. Again, that's just my opinion, and those who listen to and watch Nevzorov may disagree with me. So, write your opinion in the comments. Let me know what you think about this person. But let's get back to the events in Chechnya. On November 30th, Yeltsin signed a decree to start a military operation in Chechnya. You see, again, it's not called a war, but a military operation. By December 9th, the Russian Federation planned to completely blockade the capital Grozny. By December 13th, they planned to capture it completely, and by December 19th to take control of the entire territory of Chechnya, hoping it would intimidate people. Yes, the country is relatively small, only 17,000 square kilometers, but how could they be so overconfident? Of course, in the end, everything turned out differently in practice. The Russian army suffered its first losses even outside the Chechen Republic, and the fighting broke out far from Grozny. The Russians were only able to begin the assault on the Chechen capital on New Year's Eve, December 31st, which was 22 days later than planned. And then Russia simply started bombing Chechnya, ordinary carpet bombings just like the fascists did in World War II. They just dropped bombs on peaceful cities, which led to the deaths of more than 120,000 civilians. Once again, Russia bombed cities, which led to the deaths of 120,000 people. And for what? For power and imperial ambitions, for money and territory, just like what's happening now in Ukraine. Just like what's happening now in Ukraine? People died during a week-long series of massive aerial bombardments, missile and artillery strikes before the main assault on Grozny. The shelling was the largest since the bombing of Dresden during World War II. Just think about the scale of this horror. The command's plan for capturing Grozny was to advance their troops in 4 armored columns toward the presidential palace during massive, intense shelling and then seize it. The key to the operation's success was that all 4 columns had to reach the final point at the same time. But the plan failed spectacularly. The Russian armored columns were stopped and blocked by the Chechens in different parts of Grozny. The armored attack, designed more to intimidate than anything else, was completely helpless in urban conditions. And intimidation made no sense. Chechen fighters blocked the Russians and destroyed them almost without resistance, shooting at the armored vehicles from the upper floors of buildings and basements, where tanks and armored personnel carriers couldn't reach. The Russian so-called soldiers who survived the Chechen attack tried to retreat carefully and set up a circular defense in the buildings. But by January 3, almost all the Russians had either been killed or surrendered. It's funny that the Russian security ministers hid their intention to storm Grozny and assured the public and the State Duma that the conflict would be resolved without significant losses or aggression. After such a heavy defeat in the Chechen capital, the head of the Russian government's press service admitted that during the New Year's offensive on Grozny, the Russian army did suffer losses in personnel and equipment. But at the same time, false information was spread that the Russian troops had supposedly taken control of the city. Doesn't that sound familiar? Looks like the Russians memorized this script back in '94 and are still using it today. Then, trying to justify their fabrication, Russian troops resumed their offensive on Grozny. There was fierce street fighting in the city. Artillery was firing all day long. They targeted everything, both civilian neighborhoods and infrastructure. As a result of the fighting in Grozny, about 35,000 civilians were killed, around 5,000 of whom were children. A significant number of those killed were ethnic Russians who, ironically, had nowhere to hide during the bombings and shelling because, unlike the local population, the victims had few relatives there. As you can see, for Russia, destroying their own people isn't new. That's what they did then, and that's what they're doing now. Only now they're destroying their own people in a different way. They simply send their relatives to fight in Ukraine, where 80 pseudo-soldiers come back in body bags. 1995. Having not yet achieved combat results in the assault on Grozny, Russian troops moved on to the next stage of the military operation, establishing military control over the entire territory of Chechnya. For this purpose, frontline aviation carried out massive bombings. During the bombing, Chechen settlements such as Shali, Bamut, Chechen Aul, and Mekki Yurt were targeted, and the shelling also spread to villages in Ingushetia. After the fall of Grozny, the Russian army continued its offensive in all directions. And on March 10, the siege of Bamut began, during which a small garrison of Chechen fighters held out under siege for more than a year, inflicting significant losses on the Russians. There are different accounts regarding the siege of Bamut, and I simply have no right to take anyone's side. However, the fact remains. The Chechen forces survived for many months in complete encirclement, while still managing to strike back at the Russians, causing real losses to Russian personnel, according to various sources, from 1,000 to 2,000 people. There used to be Bamut, now it's Bakhmut. Names change. Bessara is gone. The fighting continued. On April 1 and 2 near Gudermes and in the city itself, the Russians lost 43 armored vehicles. At this time, one of the most terrible war crimes of the Chechen War was committed, the Samashki massacre. After capturing the village of Samashki, Russian soldiers committed a mass killing of civilians. According to various sources, up to 300 Chechen civilians were killed. All these terrible events were hushed up for a short time. At that time, propaganda in Russia was not as solid as it is now. The truth was known, and under the pressure of the State Duma and the population of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin had to consider the possibility of starting negotiations. The continuation of hostilities in Chechnya could seriously hinder Russia on the international stage. In addition, because of the war, leaders of other countries could not come to Moscow for May 9th. In this regard, Yeltsin signed a decree on normalizing the situation in the Chechen Republic, according to which he declared a moratorium on hostilities until May 11, 1995. You already understand that this was just another pause. After that, active hostilities resumed, Russia launched a large-scale offensive, and the Air Force resumed bombing mountain villages, which again led to heavy civilian casualties. But despite the systematic bombings of these areas, the Chechen forces began to resist more fiercely and strongly. The Russian forces' offensive stopped, and fierce and prolonged positional battles began. By the end of the second period of the campaign, the conflict once again entered a stage of escalation of armed struggle. In the summer and autumn, the fighting was constantly frozen and then reignited. By the end of 1995, the Chechen army had about 10,000 soldiers, including children and women. The entire people were literally fighting there. During this period, there was almost no active combat. Instead, the Chechen armed forces waged a guerrilla war, which had a strong impact on the future of Chechnya. The year 1996. In the last year of the war, Russian servicemen chose a scorched earth tactic. Chechen towns and villages were literally turned into ruins. People were left with nothing. And afterwards, among this same affected population, the Russians carried out so-called brutal sweep operations, which can once again be confidently called the genocide of the Chechen people. Again, a rhetorical question. Doesn't this remind you of anything? In Ukraine, Russia is doing the same thing. The same kind of sweeps, the same scorched earth, the same genocide. Fighting persisted all year, with combat operations occurring in Chechnya. The fighting was especially fierce in the southern mountainous regions and in the west of the country, in the area of Bamut, which the Russian army could not capture for more than a year. On March 6, the Chechen army under the command of Aslan Maskadov occupied most of Grozny, where soldiers seized warehouses with weapons and ammunition, but they did not fully capture the capital. After that, in the fighting in the villages, in Samashki and Starye Achkoy, the Russians were ambushed and suffered heavy losses. A streak of bad luck began for the Russian Federation, and with each month it only got worse. Military defeats and increasing losses of the Russian army caused growing discontent within Russia itself. In Chechnya, on the contrary, everything was moving toward the logical conclusion of the conflict, and even the assassination of the president of Ichkeria, Dzhokhar Dudayev, on April 22, 1996, did not weaken the combat capability of the Chechen army. On August 6, 1996 in Chechnya, a small unit of the Chechen army, numbering about 1,000 soldiers, entered Grozny with renewed strength. There, despite the numerical superiority of the Russians, the Chechens managed to capture almost the entire capital in a matter of hours, and later also the other major cities of Chechnya, Argun, Gudermes, and then Shali. At the same time, in Argun, the Russian military managed to hold only the military nomenclature building, while Gudermes was surrendered by them without a fight. After these events, Russia began to openly threaten the Chechen people, issuing an ultimatum: either the Chechens leave the capital or it will be leveled to the ground. But nothing went beyond words. The issue was resolved by Alexander Lebed, the Russian president's representative in the Chechen Republic, who went to Chechnya and started peace talks. Russia understood that things couldn't get any worse. With each month, it was losing more and more money and reputation. Essentially, it was simply no longer worth it for Russia. On August 31, 1996, a peace agreement was signed in Khasavyurt, according to which Russian troops had to leave the Chechen Republic by December 31, 1996. With this document, the Russian side was essentially recognizing Chechnya's independence, while the legal formalization of its recognition was postponed until 2001. The end of the war and its consequences. It all ended with the victory of the Chechen people, who, despite enormous losses, still stood their ground and gained their independence. According to official Russian data, the Russian army lost about 5,500 soldiers. However, most researchers believe that these numbers are underestimated. Most likely, the number is between 20 and 50,000 Russian soldiers killed, which is what most independent researchers claim. There is evidence that the Russian leadership did not include contract soldiers in the official casualty lists. That's why it's very difficult to fully trust the reported figures. According to official Chechen data, the losses of the Chechen army amounted to about 3,000 servicemen. But again, these numbers may also be underestimated because there is no data on all the casualties. Civilian casualties in Chechnya, according to various estimates, were estimated at up to 120,000 killed. At the same time, more than half of the Chechens were deliberately exterminated by the Russians. The actions of the aggressors are pure genocide in its most brutal form. People were exterminated simply for existing, just like it was in 2022 in Ukrainian Bucha, Irpin, Kherson, Mariupol, and other cities that lived or are still living under occupation. Such a temporary end to the war between Russia and Chechnya cannot be called good. Any war means losses and crimes, and any victory in war comes with a huge number of deaths and hardships. The worst thing is when this victory turns out to be short-lived, as it happened with Chechnya. The First Russo-Chechen War actually ended very badly for Chechnya. Despite gaining independence, the state was almost completely destroyed. This war is considered one of the largest in the past 100 years. The Russian Federation simply carried out massive and total shelling of peaceful cities, both from the air and from the ground. In addition, Russia exterminated a significant part of the indigenous Chechen population. Ordinary citizens of its own country, mothers and children, also died. Here's another example. When something doesn't go according to plan for the Russian Federation, it simply starts destroying homes, people, and land. The Russian Federation has never had a clear objective in its conflicts. This is an aggressor country for which life means nothing. Finally, everyone who still tries to somehow justify this mess needs to understand this. The Second Chechen War. I sometimes hear the opinion that we shouldn't resist, that if Russia takes over Ukraine, so what? Ukraine will just be under Russia, but at least there won't be a war. At least no one else will die. But that's an illusion that has nothing to do with reality. If Russia had captured Ukraine, there would have been many times more deaths. Not right away, but later. When Russia spread its propaganda throughout Ukraine, everyone would have their rights restricted, and many who disagreed would face torture, prisons, and executions. And then, using Ukraine, Russia would start a larger war with Europe and the entire civilized world. Again, many brainwashed people write saying, "Semyon, how do you know all this? How could it have been? This is all untrue. You're not a clairvoyant." Yes, I'm not a clairvoyant, but I know history, and I can analyze facts from events that have already happened. And today I will prove it to you 100%. You will understand why probably peace is impossible anywhere on the planet as long as Russia exists. And right now by Russia, I don't mean the ordinary people, although their guilt in the war is no less, but rather the gang of criminals sitting in the Kremlin. Why did the Second Chechen War start? It would seem 1996, the war was over. Both sides lost at least half of their personnel, destroyed their economies, and ruined their reputations on the international stage. Russia was completely pushed out of global politics and was on the verge of a coup. Its system was completely destabilized. But unfortunately, the modern, fully totalitarian policies of countries like Russia are set up in such a way that only through war can the state generate income and maintain stable power. This is what the Russian Federation has been guided by throughout its entire existence. Essentially, it's the same kind of professional deformation, when a country can no longer live peacefully or conduct its policies democratically. Russia has gotten used to living in constant conflict and war. Business and the economy there are based on this. So, after the 1998 default, when the Russian economy finally collapsed, Vladimir Putin became the head of the FSB after numerous reorganizations. The idea of a quick and victorious war was very appealing to the authorities and businessmen. In addition, the threat of a restoration of communist power had not been eliminated. At that time, a conspiracy against the leadership was brewing in Kremlin circles. Therefore, what was needed was a so-called small war, which would in fact bring the Russian Federation to a state of military dictatorship, slow down democratic processes and transfers of power, and also guarantee the preservation of political processes during Yeltsin's rule. Putin helped with this, who, by the way, unlike previous candidates, was the most suitable figure to head the FSB. First, he guaranteed Yeltsin immunity from upcoming prosecution. Second, he agreed to all military adventures. As they say, if you want money, start a war. That's exactly how Russia decided to get rid of its deep economic crisis. After Russia's actual defeat in the First Russo-Chechen War, numerous Russian political circles, especially the military, expressed dissatisfaction with the results of the Khasavyurt agreements, believing that the Chechen problem was not solved, but merely postponed. At the same time, the young state of Ichkeria did not gain independence. There was no international support through recognition of its sovereignty by the leading world powers and the UN. Most military experts already understood back then that Russia would attack again. The Chechens expected this as well. After the War of 1994-1996, Chechnya literally fell back in terms of living standards by 50 to 70 years. The country was devastated after carpet bombings. Economic and political problems began to grow. The level of corruption and crime increased significantly. People became very cruel and quite conservative. Under, so to speak, an iron grip, people began to violate each other's rights. It got to the point where extremism and street violence emerged. People began to be punished with lashes in the streets. And since 1997, Chechen authorities even began resorting to public executions. Because of the danger inside the country and at its borders, most of the indigenous population simply left Chechnya. At the same time, life went on, and in 1997 elections were held in the country where Aslan Maskadov was elected president. To say that the elections changed much would not be true. At that time, there were many paramilitary groups in the country that were not under government control. One of them began military actions in Dagestan in August 1999. The uprising was suppressed. And the Russian command, using this as a pretext for invasion, launched the second military campaign against Ichkeria, which was no less bloody than the first. There is another interesting fact. A few hours before the war began on September 30, 1999, in an interview with the Russian newspaper Kommersant, Vladimir Putin stated that there would be no new war with Chechnya. On the same evening, tank units of the Russian army entered the territory of the Naursky and Shelkovsky districts of Chechnya from the direction of Dagestan and the Stavropol region. Honestly, I don't understand. How can brainwashed Russians believe Putin? He lies every step of the way. There has never been any truth in his words. Phases of the conflict and main events. The 10 years of war can generally be divided into 3 phases: the preparatory phase, the regular active phase, and the partisan phase. There are 2 opposing opinions regarding its conclusion. Some believe this war is completely over, saying that Chechnya has begun to live according to Russian standards in peace and tranquility. Others insist that the current peace in Chechnya is not the end of the war, but merely a lull. I myself am increasingly leaning toward the second option. The Chechens remain silent as long as it benefits them. But these people have hardly forgotten all the atrocities committed by Russia and are unlikely to have forgiven their neighbors for the open genocide. Conflict events. The first one began in the spring of 1999. Before the start of the main hostilities, a number of important events took place that marked the transition of the Second Chechen War from the first stage to the second. On March 5 in Grozny, the representative of the Russian mission, Major General Gennady Shpion, was kidnapped. This served as a pretext for the Russian army to prepare for the next military campaign in Chechnya. On August 7, the conflict escalated in Dagestan, involving illegal Chechen formations of the Islamic Peacekeeping Brigade led by Shamil Basayev. In response, Russian aviation carried out a series of bombing raids on the southeast of Chechnya and Grozny. After a month of fighting, the Chechens were forced to retreat. And then there were some very interesting events. From September 4 to 16, a series of explosions occurred in residential buildings. In Buynaksk, in Moscow, in Volgodonsk. As a result, 293 people died. There are 2 versions regarding the organizers of the tragedy. It was either Chechen terrorists or the Russian FSB, which acted as the mastermind. I can't say with 100% certainty who organized these terrorist acts. I've reviewed a lot of material, and it's really all very confusing. But judging by the style and the subsequent events, personally, I'm sure that all of this was organized by Putin himself. At that time, he was essentially in charge of the FSB, and these actions laid the groundwork for resetting the country so that it would move onto a war footing and worship a dictator, which is exactly what happened. As they say, you always need to look for the ultimate beneficiary. After all, thanks to these events, Putin ascended to the throne, where he has been sitting for more than 20 years. Naturally, the Russian authorities blamed the Chechens for everything. And on September 23, Boris Yeltsin signed a decree on measures to increase the effectiveness of counter-terrorist operations in the North Caucasus region of the Russian Federation. On September 29, Russia issued an ultimatum to Chechnya demanding the handover of the organizers of the bombings. And the next day, an offensive operation began along with brutal bombings of Chechen cities. That's the logic for you, and I don't understand how anyone can support this. Even if we theoretically assume that the explosions were really organized by the Chechens and not the Russian FSB, and that the Chechen government refuses to hand them over, then why start bombing the civilian population? Why bomb cities and kill innocent people? But Russia is a great country, right? It's allowed to do that by the right of the strongest, isn't it? Remind me, who was the last one in history to do that? Second phase, regular war. This period covers 2 years of active combat operations, 1999 and 2000. At the beginning of the Second Chechen War, the Russian leadership made it clear in every possible way that they had learned the lessons of the first one. This mainly concerned the information support of the war and the tactics of conducting it. The number of Russian troops increased several times. Among them were more experienced units, which also tried to avoid casualties among their personnel. In addition, the Russian army had undergone active combat training over the past years and was preparing for an offensive on Chechnya. Its actions were no longer as impulsive and chaotic as they were in 1994. Before the infantry was sent into battle, there was prolonged artillery preparation and air bombardments. Russia advanced gradually, and I would even say carefully. This slowed the operation, but there was no need to rush. At first, the Russians tried to establish control over the northern part of Chechnya up to the Terek River and thus create a buffer zone. But later, in October, the troops crossed the Terek River and began preparations for the assault on Grozny. The operation to capture the Chechen capital lasted about 3 months and cost the Russian troops serious losses. Sources do not provide an exact number. The information varies, but on average, daily losses can be estimated at about 40 to 50 soldiers. Prolonged shelling almost leveled Grozny to the ground. In the end, the capital was taken. Some of the Chechen units left the city, others were killed. Along with active offensives and bombings in Chechnya, Russia radically changed its information warfare tactics. In 1999, Russian propaganda rose to the level of a full-fledged information army of the Russian Federation, which turned ordinary people into blind zombies, ready to do and listen to everything they were told. The war unleashed at that time used the same colonial rhetoric: savage peoples who needed to be subdued and radical Islamists with whom it was pointless to negotiate. The Russian Federation has spoken many times throughout its existence about peoples who are supposedly begging for liberation. Identical monologues about liberation were broadcast by the Kremlin during the full-scale attack on Ukraine in 2022. The rhetoric is still the same, just like the aggressive actions of the Russian Federation. A pre-prepared propaganda strategy for victory in the war helped the Russians achieve a number of significant victories in 1999, while receiving a response of joy and support from the civilian population. But what kind of support are we talking about when people are dying under shelling? They are dying because the inadequate Russian authorities decided to use the war to make money and establish a dictatorial regime. But even then, very few people in Russia noticed this. Chechnya was the enemy, and its people were the victims whom Russia's so-called hero went to save. The second year of the war began with the mass killing of a group of civilians in the village of Novye Aldi and the surrounding areas of Russia. Then the Russians captured the capital, as well as the cities Nozay Yurt, Vedeno, Serdzin Yurt, Argun Gorj, Itumkale, and Shatoy. On February 4-7, 2000, the Russian army shelled and carried out airstrikes using high-explosive bombs on the village of Katyr Yurt, resulting in the deaths of 167 people. The authorities never acknowledged what happened as unlawful, either publicly or in official documents. As a result, the victims did not receive any assistance. After a month of intense shelling and offensives, by March 20, Russian troops had established control over all of Chechnya. This event can be considered the end of the regular war. After that, the third stage of hostilities began under de facto occupation. The third phase, guerrilla warfare. On April 20, 2000, Deputy Chief of the Russian General Staff Valery Manilov announced that the military campaign in Chechnya was over. On January 23, 2001, Putin decided to partially withdraw troops from the neighboring country. The former Supreme Mufti of Ichkeria, Ahmad Kadyrov, was appointed chairman of Chechnya. Despite the so-called military operation ending, people in Chechnya continued to die. Both Russian units and pro-Kremlin Chechen forces, the Kadyrovtsi, fought against the Chechens, as well as the special battalions Vostok and Zapad, commanded by Sulim Yamadayev and Said Magomed Kakiev. The internal war did not go away. The Chechen people continued to fight for independence and freedom with partisan units, while Russian forces continued to exterminate them. In the first year after the so-called military operation ended, or to put it plainly, the war, there were 5 railroad bombings and 6 terrorist attacks. The Chechens carried out several raids, including an attack on Gudermes, the second largest city in Chechnya, in September 2001, and Gilav's unit's attack on Ingushetia in September 2002. Life under occupation, of course, was not liberation in any real sense. At the same time, along with so-called rescue, Chechens were locked in basements and simply abused, something almost no one in Russia heard about. Everything was kept quiet. And this is called a peaceful operation? Is this how you save a brotherly nation? On April 1, 2004, Kadyrov's men carried out a special operation in the village of Samashki, after which 27 people were reported missing. That's how it worked. People just disappeared. Then another terrible tragedy happened. On May 9, 2004 in Grozny at the Dynamo Stadium, where a parade was taking place, at 10:35 a powerful explosion occurred on the newly renovated VIP stand. At that moment, the following were present: President of Chechnya Akhmat Kadyrov, Head of the State Council of the Chechen Republic Hussein Isaev, Commander of the Joint Group of Troops in the North Caucasus, Colonel General Valery Baranov, Minister of Internal Affairs of Chechnya Alu Alkanov, and the military commandant of the Republic Grigory Fomenko. 2 people died immediately in the explosion. 4 more died in hospitals: Akhmat Kadyrov, Hussein Isaev, Reuters journalist Adlan Kasanov, a child, and 2 of Kadyrov's security personnel. A total of 63 people were injured in the explosion in Grozny, including 5 children. 11 years after the assassination of Akhmat Kadyrov, the masterminds behind this event are still in doubt. Official Russian sources call the explosion a terrorist attack without any specifics or facts. To this day, the death of the president of Chechnya in Russia remains buried under a thick layer of propaganda and convenient stories. Unofficially, Putin himself is suspected of being behind the assassination of Akhmat Kadyrov. It is believed that the order for the elimination of the Chechen president came from him. In the last years of his life, Akhmat became less obedient to the Kremlin. He became inconvenient for Russia and Putin. Because of this, Kadyrov's authority among the local population of Chechnya only grew stronger. Many people really respected him and followed his example, meaning they tried to resist the Russian authorities. This could have been the reason for Akhmat's assassination. In the middle of the day on May 9, Putin confirmed the report about the death of the Chechen president. Afterwards, he received his son Ramzan in the Kremlin and expressed his personal condolences. And then, Ramzan Kadyrov miraculously gained status, power, and money. Don't you think this is more than just a coincidence? Write what you think about it in the comments. And in general, subscribe to my channel and check out my Telegram. In general, after 2004, Chechen partisan activity began to decline. The final turning point in the conflict between Chechnya and Russia was the assassination of Aslan Maskhadov by Russian special forces. This happened on March 8, 2005 and became the final event of the Second Chechen War, which undermined the ability and willingness of the Chechens to fight against Russian forces. This was influenced both by the brutal killings of Chechen leaders and by the simple exhaustion of the country, which the Russians were basically trying to wipe off the face of the earth on all fronts. There was no talk of liberation or any other good intentions. In 2006, Vladimir Putin stated at a press conference that it was possible to talk about the end of the counter-terrorist operation in Chechnya. However, it took another 3 years before the head of the NAC, Alexander Bortnikov, following the orders of Dmitry Medvedev, lifted the counter-terrorist operation regime in Chechnya. On December 23-25, 2008, a special operation by the FSB and the Ministry of Internal Affairs took place in the village of Alkun in Ingushetia. There, Field Commander Vakh Generaliev, who fought Russian troops in Chechnya and Ingushetia since 1999, was killed. A total of 12 militants were eliminated. And almost a year later, on April 16, 2009, the CTO regime came to an end. There was no one left to fight or resist, and even Chechnya itself, after 10 years, shifted to a softer policy. Everything quieted down for a while. What does the 10-year war remain silent about? The result of the Second Chechen War, complete occupation of Ichkeria. At the same time, it's a mistake to think that after 2009, the Chechen struggle for freedom stopped altogether. The Chechens needed time to regroup. After a decade of fighting, not only the economy suffers, but also the military potential. Despite this, over the next 4 years, several large-scale armed actions for the independence of the Chechen people took place in Chechnya. During the Second Chechen War, more than 16,000 Chechens were killed, and more than 7,000 Russian soldiers, and the figures regarding the civilian population are simply an insult to the Chechen people. It's an insult to the memory of those Russia killed. According to official Russian data, about 1,000 people died, but in reality, according to independent research, more than 20 to 25,000 people were killed. Later, as many as 52 mass grave sites were discovered, similar to the one that Russian criminals created in Bucha. According to estimates by the human rights organization Amnesty International, the Second Russo-Chechen War was accompanied by systematic human rights violations, including extrajudicial executions and torture. Most of the crimes remain unpunished, although in rare cases, victims managed to receive compensation from the Russian government through decisions of the European Court. During the war, the Russian army established hundreds of filtration camps, which became very common since 1999. Some of them even received the status of pre-trial detention centers, subordinated to the Ministry of Justice, but with unclear legal status and no apparent basis in the criminal code. The purpose of such camps was to detain suspects who might have cooperated with the Chechen army, and those considered as such were the soldiers themselves, their acquaintances, and their relatives. Even someone with the same last name as a serviceman could be taken to the detention center without even checking whether he was actually related to the serviceman. According to Musa Dalsayev, the president of the Chechen Association of Psychiatrists, systematic abuse and executions of prisoners took place in the filtration camps. Another feature of the filtration camps was the lack of documentation about a person in the camp, which meant they could automatically be sent there again. As of December 23, 2001, there were more than 800 filtration camps and filtration points operating in Chechnya. The most well-known filtration camp was the pre-trial detention center in the village of Chernokozovo, Narsky district, Chechnya. It was established in 1999 on the basis of a closed high-security correctional colony. There were systematic human rights violations, torture, beatings, rapes, and murders carried out there. The detention center staff were contract servicemen from Rostov, Volgograd, and Vladikavkaz. According to one of the former inmates, the guards worked in 3 shifts. They never showed their faces. The contract servicemen received about 1,000 rubles per day. They called their victims one by one and simply abused them. Throughout the entire day, the prisoners had to stand with their hands raised, except for those who lost consciousness. The camp workers also amused themselves by releasing tear gas into the cells before roll call. This primarily affected people's health, especially the elderly and children. The detention center workers also established a system of receiving ransom from the relatives of the prisoners. If the ransom was not collected within the allotted time, the detainees either went missing or were transferred to another prison in the Russian Federation. The most terrible thing is that there was practically no global reaction to such numerous human rights violations, to thousands of murders and acts of abuse. There was intense propaganda from the Russian Federation, which concealed most of the crimes. The Russian political leadership, first and foremost Vladimir Putin, whose main election campaign was the so-called counter-terrorist operation in Chechnya, justified the actions of the Russian military. According to the Memorial Human Rights Center and the International Helsinki Federation, as of November 2006, only a few criminal cases regarding war crimes in Chechnya made it to court. Most of the accused were acquitted, amnestied, or received minimal or suspended sentences. As for torture, as of November 2006, Human Rights Watch was aware of only one case in which an official was convicted for violence against detainees. In addition to propaganda, Russia tried to conceal the results of its crimes with mass burials. Chechens were not only exterminated without leaving any memory of them, but their homes were deliberately destroyed, peaceful civilians were robbed, and both adults and children were raped. A brutal genocide of the entire Chechen people was taking place, a genocide that Russia still does not acknowledge to this day. Unfortunately, the same thing is happening now in Ukraine. Russian non-humans are destroying the peaceful population by all possible means. What happened more than 10 years ago in Chechnya is now happening on Ukrainian soil. The same torture, the same violence, the same deadly detention centers and mass graves. Nothing has changed, not even Putin. It pains me to see these horrific videos where Russian killers film the execution of a Ukrainian soldier, commenting on their cruelty as they record it, cruelty that would have been unimaginable even 100 years ago. This is not normal, this is not war, and unfortunately this is not an isolated case. This is a total violation of human rights. This is genocide against Ukrainians. This is a crime for which a life sentence is given without hesitation. Russia has no chance for forgiveness or justification. For all the war crimes in Georgia, Chechnya, Ukraine, America, and many other countries, the Russian Federation must be brought to trial at the international level as soon as possible. Everyone must receive an equal punishment for what they've done, including Putin himself. Millions of Russians have the blood of millions of people just like them on their hands. Now almost everyone knows about this, but it's time to stop staying silent and finally do something about it on a legal level. What happened in Chechnya and what is happening now in Ukraine is an indicator. This is a picture for the whole world, which still feels sorry for the good Russians and justifies the Kremlin. The Putin system must come to an end. And this will happen very, very soon. As a brief summary, I want to say Ichkeria was occupied 23 years ago. To this day, it lives under Russian rule and is still deprived of its rightful freedom. But this is not the end of life or Russian Chechen history. There will be more to come. As they say, revenge is best served cold. Write in the comments what you know about the Second Chechen War. And what do you think? When will the Chechen people rise up again?